One of the things that I'm happiest that ECAWAR has over the years stood up clearly in concern about was the occupation of Afghanistan. And of course, one of the worst little pieces of the story of Afghanistan was the creation of Guantanamo and the horrors that were part of that story. This afternoon we have Robert Betty here who's going to talk about the Canadian who is probably best known for his time and his experiences in Guantanamo, Omar Khadr. And so I'm going to ask Robert to come and share a little bit about that story and maybe a bit of an update of where things are at now as well in relation to Omar and what's happening with him. Robert.
Yeah. You know what, I'm 6'4" and have a pretty booming voice. Is it okay if I stand here and ditch the mic for a few minutes? Gives me a little more room to move around and I don't have to worry about if I'm talking too close or too far. Plus I'll be able to set my timer and try and keep you guys on schedule here for my part of the discussion this morning. Thank you so much for coming out today. Lots of really interesting and moving discussions and issues. As I was sitting there listening to our previous speaker, I was thinking to myself, you know, how many times do we see situations where somebody says these horrible words, the end justifies the means? And I think it's an illness that is so prevalent in our world today, but certainly in our country today. So much of what is going on at all different levels of our operation as a country and our government is all about using an illegitimate means to achieve an end which we may or may not even agree with the end, but we certainly disagree with many of the means that are being pursued today. And Omar Khadr's story is very much all about that. Edmonton Coalition Against War and Racism, well, anytime you're going to have a war, you've got to have somebody to be against. You need an other. You need usually a faceless other to scapegoat and to be hostile towards. And essentially Omar Khadr and by extension his family has become that scapegoat for our current government and for many Canadians, sadly to say. So in many ways I've been involved in working on Omar Khadr's case for 4 years now. And for me it's become a twofold concern. First of all, as I've grown to know more and more about this young man, it's become a fight for the life of a young man who deserves to have people to stand up for him. But equally and perhaps even more importantly, for me it's become a fight for the soul of our country. I see so many issues in this case that speak to changes in the nature of the country that I was brought up in and the nature of the country that I'm bringing my children up in. And it makes me sad to say it, but I really do think that the soul of our country is at stake in issues like this. We heard some parallel discussions here earlier of just how close to home this can move right into your bedroom, basically, these kinds of concerns. So who am I? I'm a local business person, self-employed. I'm the poster child for the Conservative Party. Self-employed, free enterprise, and on a fiscal basis, I would have to cast myself as a small c conservative in many ways. I'm not ashamed to say I've voted progressive conservative. I don't think I ever will or ever would be able to vote for the current Conservative Party, though. And my experience with the Omar Khadr case has made that a very entrenched position because I've had a lot of first-hand contact with different levels of our government on this issue. My wife is Arlette Zink, Dr. Arlette Zink. If you've followed the case in the newspaper, you're probably aware that she and some of her colleagues at King's University College here in Edmonton have been very active in trying to bring an element of humanity and support to Omar Khadr, especially during his tenure in Guantanamo, in that they've put together an educational program for a young man who has spent the last 10 years without anything like an education. That's how I initially got involved when the students at King's were presented with a lecture on justice by one of Omar Khadr's lawyers, Mr. Dennis Edney, a local hero in my opinion. And the students at that university were both inspired and motivated to get involved, which is a wonderful thing when young people see an issue and want to do something to change it. And within 3 months of hearing Dennis Edney speak, the students at King's pulled together resources and people and press and all sorts of things, and they had 700 people at the Winspear Center to learn about the Omar Khadr case about 4 years ago now. And that's when I was hooked. When I saw what they did and saw what Dennis Edney had committed to, and just saw the heart-wrenching story of this young man, I was on board to get involved. Over the last number of years, my role has been primarily to support my wife's efforts. She's been to Guantanamo on 3 occasions, once to appear at Omar Khadr's sentencing hearing after his trial and plea deal were concluded, and then twice this year in that awful interim period after he was supposed to have been returned to Canada and our government was stalling. The U.S. military made the extraordinary arrangements for a civilian to come down and spend the better part of 2 weeks over a period of 2 months doing one-on-one tutoring essentially with this young man, because the reality of Guantanamo Bay is it's not a place that's set up to rehabilitate, it's not set up to reform, it's not set up to handle children, and that's exactly what Omar Khadr needed. So we're talking about both an issue and an individual. Who is the individual? Well, Omar Khadr was born on September 19th, 1986 in Toronto. And that's an important point because if you read a lot of the media, it's long forgotten that he's accused of being a Canadian of convenience. Well, I don't know how convenient it is to pick where you get born, but he was born a Canadian just like I was and probably many of you were. And not that there's different levels of Canadian. If you have citizenship, you're a citizen whether you were born here or not. But the reality is that it's ludicrous, some of the accusations that are made that this gentleman who was born in Toronto is somehow a lesser Canadian. At age 10, he and his family moved to Afghanistan. And you often hear also in discussions in the press about how he had choices and he should have made different choices. Well, at age 10, I don't know how mature any of you were, but my parents didn't come to me and ask where I wanted to live or anything like that. I was just along for the ride at age 10. So he spent the next 5 years in Afghanistan in what was undoubtedly a very unusual upbringing. Somewhere along the line, lo and behold, September 11th happens and the world changes. He's in Afghanistan. He's there with his family who are involved and entrenched into that culture, into that organization. There's lots of discussion that we could have, and I'm not going to be on schedule if I do much of it, but lots of discussion about what happened on the day in 2002. But on July 27th in 2002, Omar Khadr was wounded on a battlefield in a very intense confrontation between a group of militants and a group of American forces that involved Apache helicopters, jet bombings, grenades, machine guns, all sorts of fun stuff. At the end of the day, he was the one survivor, and there was one American soldier who was tragically killed as well. And because he was the survivor, he was therefore, by extension, the one who must have killed the American soldier. And he spent the next 10 years of his life in various stages of incarceration and interrogation under American forces, both in Bagram and in Guantanamo Bay. Absolutely. Absolutely. He was not only the youngest detainee in Guantanamo, he was also the only Western citizen to have been left to face the military tribunal process by his country. So he was a very unique case. And at the end of the day, faced with the certainty of a conviction under that system, Omar Khadr elected a little over 2 years ago now to accept a plea deal offer from the American government. And he pleaded guilty to all charges. He signed on to a statement of facts that was presented to him by the American government, which basically said he was a horrible guy and did everything that they said. And in exchange for that, he was given a sentence of 8 years of additional incarceration. After 1 year, he was eligible for return to Canada. And although that was slow coming, after 2 years, he actually did return to Canada, and Omar Khadr is now in Millhaven Prison just outside of Kingston. He is to face the rest of his sentence. He's being assessed and evaluated by Corrections Canada as to where he will do that and how that will process. So that's sort of a very quick timeline of the case. That's Omar Khadr, the individual. What about Omar Khadr, the issue? Well, the issues involved run to the very core of the values that bring you here today. You know, issues like habeas corpus, the right to face your accuser and know what you're being accused of. Well, Omar Khadr spent more than 2 years there before he even was charged in Guantanamo Bay, before even being charged with anything, before having any access to counsel or even to Canadian consular officials. The rule of law, it's just first line in our Constitution, recognizing our respect for God and the rule of law. It's right there in line 1. And yet we seem to have abandoned that Constitution in many ways. Because what do we see? We see the Supreme Court twice ruling in Omar Khadr's favor in actions, but basically zero benefit accruing to him as a result of those rulings because of obstinance by the government and a willingness to dare his legal team to try and force them to fulfill the edicts of the Supreme Court. And correspondingly, rule of law, you see the American side of things, you see the creation of Guantanamo Bay, which is a creation specifically to avoid the complications and hindrances of the rule of law. The Charter of Rights I mentioned earlier is another important thing that we all value, and yet on 2 occasions he's been upheld as having had his charter rights violated, and yet he's still in prison, still not accruing any of those benefits. And of course, you mentioned so rightly torture. The right to be free from torture is something that we all would like to think is a core Canadian value, and yet Omar Khadr, a Canadian citizen, was not only tortured on numerous occasions under American purview, but he was also subjected to torture there with direct participation in the form of 3-week sleep deprivation programs and that sort of thing by CSIS agents, which is the root cause of course, one of the Supreme Court decisions in his favor. At the end of the day, Omar Khadr was facing the very real possibility of spending the rest of his life in Guantanamo Bay, and even with the plea deal where he was supposed to be returned to Canada in the fall of 2011, it was very clear that the Harper government was going to stall and obfuscate and ignore that obligation made. And so I got involved with a couple of students from they had made with Omar Khadr, and established a website, and we established an informational document, which I'm going to invite you to take home and maybe take an extra copy if you feel so inclined. Omar Khadr is back in Canada, and while there are certainly shortcomings in the Canadian system and limitations in our justice system, it's a whole different world for him today compared to when he was in Guantanamo Bay. The reality is he will at some point become a free Canadian citizen once again. And that's something we can be thankful for. But having said that, there's a lot of work still to be done to educate Canadians, because we've had months, if not years, of media that has basically scapegoated this young man, courtesy of our current government, which for whatever reason has decided that this young man is going to be their example of how they're tough on terrorism and tough on crime. I don't claim to have a miraculous bird's eye view into what exactly happened in July of 2002 when he was on that battlefield, but I know for sure that I have a 17-year-old boy, and I see lots of things that I'm thankful that he's not as accountable for as Omar Khadr has been held accountable for the events of that day. And the tragedy of the last 10 years is that so many things, child soldier status, youth status, all these things are just swept aside because it's this evil other that we are being asked to accept this person as being, that is somehow not worthy of the same rights and considerations that we expect for ourselves and for our children. You know, you have, on the very day that he was brought back to Canada, you have Vic Taves saying that Omar Khadr is a known supporter of Al-Qaeda terrorist network and a convicted terrorist. Well, he is convicted because he did sign the plea deal, but the reality is there's so much more depth to what does a conviction mean when it happens in Guantanamo Bay? What does a guilty plea mean when it's done as an only under the pressures of 10 years of incarceration with the strong likelihood, I would argue certainty, of spending the rest of your life in that position? The press, though, when you read any news articles, you will continue to read convicted terrorist and murder Omar Khadr, because the reality is they've got their 50 words or 200 words or whatever, how many words their editor's given them. They aren't given 5 pages each time to talk about the nature of a guilty plea in Guantanamo Bay. At the end of the day, it all boils down to the end never justifies the means, and if we can't hang on to our values where the means are the important thing that we have to assess, then I think we're sadly lost. So for the good of Omar Khadr and for the good of the soul of Canada, I would invite you today to take some of this information home. We've created a website, we've put lots of really good links. If it's an issue that you're interested in, please take a few minutes to become better informed, because you can make a difference in your community. I guarantee you that when it comes up for parole, there will be a flurry of press, and we'll be hearing all sorts of very, very contemnatory statements from various elements of our society and our government about how we got to be tough on this young man. I think an informed position, there's certainly a lot of nuance. You don't necessarily have to be soft on crime to be fair on crime. But to be informed is the first step towards being fair. And I would invite you to become informed and also to share that information when you have an opportunity, because I've found 100% of the cases where I've met with reasonable, concerned Canadians who are worried about their safety in the light of the Khadr case. It takes 5 to 10 minutes of careful discussion and explanation of the complexities of it, and within 5 to 10 minutes, they're almost universally either supportive or at least surprised at the fact that this isn't a clear-cut, horrible person. And of course, I have the added benefit of my wife has had first-hand contact with this young man. My family members and myself have been in correspondence with him over the years, so we actually have the benefit of knowing him. So I don't expect you to necessarily give me full benefit of the doubt the way I do to him, but I don't doubt for a minute that if you spend 20 minutes just learning a little bit more about the case, you'll come away with a whole different perspective on it. But I wanted to leave, I guess I did take my 15 minutes, but I wanted to leave a couple minutes to answer questions, because I'd be happy to address any details that obviously I can't go into all of them here today, but I'd love to answer some questions. Go ahead.
You didn't mention Janice Williams, who wrote a book
Yes.
about Omar Khadr.
Yes. Janice Williamson wrote actually it's an anthology of a number of works on the subject. It ranges from human rights approaches to legal approaches. It's an excellent resource as well, for sure, and it's actually referenced in our document. There's a ton of good information, and this case is going to be studied for decades and centuries to come in terms of Canadian human rights. So it's a really valuable one to get informed. Yes?
Are you planning, now that, I mean, I know it's not great for Omar Khadr, but things are a little better because he's in Canada.
Yes.
Are you planning to extend your, whatever, your website or crusade to help other people who are in a similar situation, or are you going to just watch out for Omar Khadr?
Well, for me personally, this is a very personal one-on-one kind of an issue. I mean, my initial interest was because of the human rights violations. I'm sure everyone in this room probably has an issue that's of particular concern to them and that they're particularly involved with. And I think we all have to pick our battles and keep our focus. I'm not saying it's the only thing I'll ever be involved in. Who knows, maybe I'll be Prime Minister someday. But having said that, it's the one thing that I'm extremely focused on right now and continue to be focused on, because it's been 10 years and it's amazing how few people have really gotten actively involved with it. You know, you've got Dennis Edneys of the world and his current legal team in Toronto who are committing huge time and resources, but there's not a lot of other people, and there is a continued need for vigilance on his behalf. Because at the end of the day, if the ultimate goal is for him to successfully reintegrate into Canada, into Canadian society, and lead a normal life, and in order to for him to be successful with that, it's going to require considerable effort on continued education. Yes?
When Omar Khadr was arrested, he was a child, obviously.
He was 15 years old when he was captured in Afghanistan.
I wonder if there is a children's rights organization in Canada, whether there is one or not, and if there is one, I don't know about what did they do. I mean, this kind of thing, like, should should be big for every human being, that when you see a child is putting through Guantanamo Bay, which we know what it is, pretty much like Abu Ghraib in Iraq and pretty much like Tarizat in Iran, a place of torture, absolutely inhuman conditions, inhuman treatment of human beings. The whole world should get up and run if a child is putting through such conditions. I wonder if there was any children's rights organizations in Canada at the time, or is there one now, or should we go around creating one so that such a condition doesn't happen to a child?
Yeah. Well, to answer your question, there are organizations and there are many individuals, and they have been very active and involved on the Khadr file for most of the last 10 years. Romeo Dallaire, for example, you may have seen a petition that he generated. Of course, he's very active on child soldiers, the child soldier nature of the Khadr case, and he had a petition lobbying heavily for the government to make good on their commitment to repatriate him from Guantanamo. I guess you could say that was ultimately successful. There were, I think, about 40,000 Canadians that signed that petition this summer, and 3 months later, Omar Khadr was back in Canada at the end of September. Whether you can draw a direct line between the two, it was all part of the political pot that was being stirred. There is, I don't remember the name of her organization, but there's a woman I've dealt with, Kathy Vandergrift in Ottawa. She's involved with a UN organization that has to do with rights of the child, and they've been very active in lobbying the government on the Khadr file as well. At the end of the day, as I'm sure you've all probably bumped heads with the current government on one issue or another, they're not particularly receptive to attempts to influence their opinion or enlighten them on their opinion. My personal experience, I have an MP that I consider to be a very intelligent, considerate young guy. Young, I guess he's young like me. Not so young, I guess. But anyway, James Rajat is, I think, a pretty good MP. But my first meetings with him he was quite receptive. And I've been meeting with him for the last 4 years. And I learned fairly quickly, and I think he maybe learned along with me, that his leadership was not interested in being enlightened on this particular issue. You know, by the second or third meeting with him, it was very, very clear that he was now giving me back the government line. He obviously had his wrist slapped, and they weren't interested in re-examining anything. And I think that's probably the experience that was had by Amnesty International and the Canadian Coalition for Rights of the Child and various other organizations. Yes?
I have 2 questions.
I'll let one last one.
Okay, sure. I understand.
We've got to move on, Robert.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay.
I'll stick around after.
I really want to say, okay, fine. Fine, okay, so do you have any idea why he is not able to use the time he served in Guantanamo as an equivalent to time here? Is there any reason that you've ever been told or anything?
Well, the terms of the plea deal were that he would get no credit for time served, and that the sentence would carry forward into the Canadian system after his repatriation under the terms that were agreed to in Gitmo. So basically, because they forced him to. But certainly, if he had been a Canadian tried in Canada, which was originally all that his legal team was asking for, was to bring him back, and whatever evidence you've got, let's have an open court and an open discussion and an open trial under the Canadian rules and regulations. A, he would have been not convicted of murder, that's for sure. But B, even if he'd been convicted of support of terrorism, whatever, he would have in the Canadian system, A, been considered a youth because of the age he was at the time he was arrested, and B, he would have received double credit for time served, which meant no matter what he got convicted of, if anything, he would have been released immediately because he had already spent 8 years in prison at the time he was pleaded out. So yeah, it's a horribly unfair system down there, and that's true for everybody down there that's been there in that prison for 10 years. If and when they finally come to trial, they'll receive no credit for time served.
Are the legal team fighting that inability to open up the case again?
You know, I'm not firsthand on the legal stuff, and they're not very public with those strategies. Yeah. I think at the end of the day, the most likely scenario is he'll be eligible for parole. You're eligible for parole at 1/3 of your sentence, which for him will be next summer. I think their focus probably right now is getting him through the evaluation process at Corrections Canada to make sure he has a safe place to spend whatever time he remains for him in incarceration, and then secondly to build the case for a successful parole hearing, so that because that's probably his quickest path. The reality of our government is that if they were to pursue it in the courts, it would probably take longer than his sentence, because they would appeal and reappeal. Everything else that they won on, they won all the time. They won at the Supreme Court level twice, and it didn't do any good. So I think they've kind of lost hope there as far as the long haul on the legal issues. Anyway,
thank you, Robert. Sorry to do that.
No, that's great.